Welcome to University Drive, your pathway to the transformational work of University of the Bahamas. Our goal is to build a better Bahamas by shaping tomorrow's leaders today, finding solutions to challenges, and forging new opportunities for growth. University Drive, where faculty, staff, students, and alumni travel the road of progress together with you. Hello everyone, I'm Tamika Lundy and welcome to University Drive. Our guests for this episode are Mr. William Fielding, researcher and adjunct faculty member in the School of Social Sciences and Director of Institutional Strengthening at University of the Bahamas, and Dr. Nyambi Hall Campbell-Dean, Associate Professor in the School of Social Sciences. Welcome to you both.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you very much.
And how have you both been doing for the semester?
Great. We're in the crunch time, the heavy time. So just continuing to do the heavy lifting, but good.
Looking forward to the home stretch.
Yeah.
And building all kinds of muscle as you get there, right?
Indeed.
So, Mr. Fielding, you and students under your supervision recently completed a study which has implications for what I'd like to call, and which you have dubbed, intimate partner relationships. It has implications, I believe, for power structures, inequalities and inequities, perhaps in law, and also societal and cultural norms. Of course, I'm talking about the study that has become one of the focal points of the protracted debate about quote unquote marital rape, as it has been coined. Dr. Dean, in my mind, this is such a complex matter to analyze and to unpack, because it encompasses the law, interpretations of the law, human relationships, societal mores, and belief systems. Mr. Fielding, let's start with you. What in essence was your study about, and what were its conclusions? That could get us started for our conversation for this episode.
All right, thank you. So what we were trying to do was, as you know, there's been a protracted debate about marital rape. We've had various prime ministers talking about a national conversation about it over several decades now. And what occurred to us was that we were talking about the need to change the law, and we talk about policies being data driven, but we noticed that there were no statistics about how common rape within marriage may be. And we thought that this was a deficiency that we should make some attempt to fill. We had done some previous studies on consent, unwanted sexual intercourse, which is effectively rape. But those studies had looked at lifetime experiences. And of course, that's somewhat different to looking at rape occurring within marriage or within a current relationship. So what we did this term with my students, we focused our questions very narrowly on current relationships and women's experiences in their current relationships, whether they be single or whether they be married. So so if they were not in an intimate partner relationship the day they saw the survey form, we would not have included them in our study. So we were very focused. And so what we did was to, first and foremost, was to try and find out how common so-called marital rape might be within marriage. And what we did was, as we know, there is as you have already said, it's a complex issue, and there is a feeling of stigma of owning up to the fact that you have been a victim of sexual abuse, whether it's male or female, obviously. But we were focusing in this study on the females. And so what we did was we asked, amongst other things, a series of nuanced questions. So the first question that we had was, have you had sex with your partner against your will? Which is a fairly sort of benign question, if you like. And then we had another question that, if you like, raised the bar a little bit. and talked about whether they felt that they had been sexually abused. So perhaps, if you like, a more severe element of not of having had sex against your will. And then finally, did they feel that they had actually been raped by their intimate partner? So you can see that these three questions are all related, but they ask it in a slightly different way. So what we found out was, when we simply had this question about having had sex with your partner against your will, in round terms, 14% of the married women said that they had experienced that with their husbands. And this compared to about 6% of the unmarried women. So there was a big difference between those two. And then when we asked about sexual abuse in marriage, it moved from the 13 or 14% that we had, it dropped down to about 13%. So it went down a little bit. And then when we asked about rape within marriage, it went down to 8.3%. So roughly 8% within marriage. So that's 1 in 12 women who are admitting that they have suffered the event of what we would have called rape if it wasn't within marriage. But they're saying that they've suffered that within marriage with their current, with their husband. So we felt that this was very important to share with the media and to try and quantify. And of course, at the same time, we know that rape is a violent act. And so we also looked at we also asked about other events that could have taken place. So a key event would be, has your current intimate partner physically hurt you? And 15% of the married women said yes to that, as opposed to about 11% of the single women. And that's a substantial difference between those two groups. So we were very interested in looking at that. And then we also looked at some other aspects as to how partners treated their women, their female partners. So, for example, we've got some information about whether the female knows whether her partner is having sex with another woman whilst they're at the same time, and so that gives you a window into what we might call sweethearting. And we also looked at some questions about the psychological abuse that women are subjected to, whether they and of course what we find is that psychological abuse, when they are subjected to sex against their will, that psychological abuse, both for males and both for single and married females, is elevated. So we can see that rape or sexual abuse is part of a package of abuse towards the female. And so this again points to the complexity which you alluded to at the beginning. And of course, it fits in with the work that Elizabeth Williams did a year or so ago, when she was looking at the mental health issues associated with women, students who had sex against their will. So we're trying to build upon what we've already, to some extent, what we already know, but extend it a little bit. And as I say, this time the big difference between what we've done this time and previously was to really focus the questions on your current intimate partner, whether that's a single man or whether it's a married man.
You have shared so very much, Mr. Fielding, and we'll get into most of what you have shared. I wanted to bring Dr. Hall Campbell in on this. You are a respected psychologist and you are an experienced academic. You are teaching in higher education. What is your reaction to all that Mr. Fielding has shared in terms of his study's findings? Mm-hmm. What is important to focus on? And then what is important for us as a society to address?
Yeah, so my first reaction is wow. Just the numbers, I think, are very compelling. And I think that they say a lot about the state of violence that we see in our communities. I do not think that it is a coincidence that we are seeing high rates of violence, the murder rates that we are seeing, and then this violence is also demonstrated in our relationships. So I think that the significance of this study is larger than just the context of rape and marital rape. I think that it really speaks to this plague of violence that we are experiencing in our communities and is addressing one aspect of it. And so what stood out to me, or one of the many things that stood out to me in the findings that Mr. Fielding said, is that rape is occurring as a package of abuse, right? And I think that that's a really important point to note, because I think sometimes when we have these conversations about marital rape and the context in which these conversations occur, especially when we have the conversations in regards to how we are going to address this under the law and what the government should do, it is often portrayed as if marital rape is an isolated incident that occurs with a situation, well, if it's acknowledged as even being able to occur, right? Because there are many conversations in which persons are saying that there is no such thing. But when we have the conversation where it is acknowledged as being able to occur, it's being viewed, I think, sometimes as an isolated incident on behalf of a mean husband or an unforgiving husband. And when we look at this data, we're seeing that no, it's something that is occurring as a package of abuse. And so we have to begin to address that package in order to really, really get a grip on this problem.
I like your intervention about looking at the wider context of all of this. And one hardly knows where to go to next in terms of steering the conversation because it's so complicated. But I guess a good place to go from here would be, Mr. Fielding, as you did your study, I don't believe you, I mean, could you have done this without addressing the question of consent? I mean, is consent something that is defined? What have our people been saying about consent? Did that come up in any way in your studies investigations?
We didn't ask in this particular instance. We didn't specifically ask about consent in the present study, but we have asked about consent in previous studies. So there is a disagreement. This isn't specific. This is in general relationships, if you like, and there is a feeling that on most occasions people feel that they have given clear consent to having wanting to engage in sexual intercourse, and there's about, I think in the last study we did, it was about 10% of the people participants who didn't say that, who said they didn't give clear consent. But most of the time people are giving consent. What that consent looks like becomes quite interesting. I did do a small focus group with some UB students, and obviously there can be cues given in terms of behavior and sort of non-verbal cues given, if you like, to show willingness. But one of the things that what was discussed, which I found quite interesting, was that people would actually have almost a written agreement. They would text each other and they would agree to meet in order to have a sexual encounter, and this would be basically written down in their text messages, but this was the purpose or a clear expectation of their in planning their encounter. And I thought that was quite an interesting use of social media, but whether these people are going to be aspiring lawyers or not, I don't know. But there was almost a written contract as to what was expected before they even met. And so consent can obviously take quite complicated and maybe novel forms that we older people might not consider in this day and age.
Your study also made a compelling point, Mr. Fielding, which is that what might be overlooked in a discussion on rapists is that men who rape their wives are typically violent persons. And I'm quoting from the study. In our research, 44% of married women who had been raped had also been physically hurt by their husbands, compared to 13% of married women who had not been raped. End of quoting your study. Nyambe, let's talk about intimate relationships and how dysfunctional ones can perpetuate this vicious cycle, especially as we talk about and sift through what's happening in terms of violence. What can you share on this?
Well, I think when we look at the cycle of violence, or specifically within the context of relationships, that there are a number of indicators. I think one that might not get as much or is not acknowledged as much as it probably should be, would be isolation. And the use of isolation as a tool within violent relationships. Because, no one just nobody enters into relationships in which they do not feel some type of care, attraction, love, right? Like nobody just says, oh, I want to be in a relationship with someone that I just feel bad the whole time that I'm in a relationship with them. So I think that it's important to acknowledge that there are steps, like there's grooming there. You don't just wake up one day and you're suddenly in a violent relationship. It's a process that happens over time. And one of the first steps in that process is often isolation. How is the person react to you having relationships with people that you had relationships with before you met them, right? Whether that's family members, cousins, aunts, or even friends. I know sometimes there's a notion that, if you're a female and you now have a romantic relationship, that man should be your only male friend, right? But that's a tool of isolation. And so I think these are some of the things that we need to begin to recognize and acknowledge, that sometimes we may think of as just being normal, right? Or a part of what you do in relationships. But how do these activities really play into unhealthy relationships that can expand into violent relationships?
Are we talking about healthy relationships enough? Are we modeling the kind of behavior that we want to see when we refer to healthy relationships? Do our children know? Do our teens know, who become young adults, who become parents? Do they know what it means to have a healthy, intimate relationship? And I'm asking because I wanted to put another layer onto that, and that is that a lot of us have gone through some serious trauma. We've lost loved ones to violence. We're losing family members and relatives to COVID-19. We're losing income and grappling with rising prices. Those are stresses. There are deteriorating family dynamics sometimes, just struggling to live. Do we need to now, more than ever, actively talk about relationships more?
Absolutely. Absolutely, we need to actively talk about healthy relationships. And I will say that we need to talk about it more. I know that the Bahamas Crisis Center did have an intervention at one point, where they were going to the high schools and having conversations with young people about healthy relationships. What is a healthy relationship? What does it look like? And I think that um, we need to talk about it, but we also need to teach it, right? Because I think that sometimes we take for granted that certain things we will just know how to do because we've been doing them forever, right? People have been getting married forever. People have been having children forever, right? People have been parenting forever. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we know how to do it in a healthy way. Oftentimes we just do what has been done. We modeled what we have seen happen. And we're not necessarily making improvements on that because, that's what my parents did and I ain't dead, right? Or you ain't dead either, right? But there's steps, there's definitely things that we need to be talking about, but also active steps that we need to be taking to ensure that we are creating healthy relationships and modeling those as well.
Are we a society that's used to having those kinds of frank conversations? You think?
I think that we're a society that's being forced to,
Mm-hmm.
right? I think that we're being forced to. When you turn on the news and you see people being shot in broad daylight, I think that the human psyche requires that we kind of turn off our awareness of that. And we compartmentalize that as being in a certain place, happening to certain people. But the reality is that we live in a very small community, and what happens to your neighbor is going to affect you. Whether your neighbor is in Lyford Key or your neighbor is in Mason's Addition, we're part of a community that is a small one. And so we have to be able to have conversations about how we interact with each other, how we talk to each other, how we resolve conflict, right? Within our relationships. How do we resolve conflict within our marriages? And what are healthy ways to do that? And I think that conversation is one that I would love to hear the church advocating for, in the same breath that they're talking about marital rape, right? So it's one thing to I think to reference the Bible in regards to what marriage is and what marriage is not, and the church stepping into, or rather the state stepping into this uh, sanctimonious relationship of marriage. But I think that if you're going to have those conversations, that you have to have them in tandem with, and here's what healthy marriage looks like, right? And not just have them within your church, but within the communities, because those conversations are coming into the community.
So it begs the question then about protections for our vulnerable groups. And Mr. Fielding, I know you asked a number of poignant questions in your study, but one that you did ask is if we are willing to project the results of the study on the wider population. This is what you wrote in your opinion that you submitted for publication, right? If we are willing to project the results of the study onto the wider population, the question to consider is, should the country change a law to provide legal protection to around 4,000 women who've reported that they've been raped by their husbands? That is a very substantial and significant question.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I mean, I think that starts to put the whole purpose of legislation into some sort of perspective as to what quantum of people are currently, if you like, completely abandoned by the law when it comes to this type of activity, This is a group of people who, if they wished, could have some recourse under the law, which they're currently denied. But what's interesting is that having discussed the results with a number of people since the article in the Tribune, is that nearly everybody says that the figure in the study is too low. And so I think we need to bear in mind, and we did allude to that in our statement, that it's probably an underestimate. So I think that we're talking about a minimum of 4,000 people. And we need to bear in mind that we've got about 45,000 married people in the country. And so the law currently abandons those 45,000 married women. If the act, which we would normally call rape, occurs to them, then as the policeman told a lady in 2012, if there was a report in the newspaper, and the lady went to the police station to give her report, and she says, "I was told that they do not get into marital affairs. They told me there's nothing they can do about it because the law says they cannot intervene in marital affairs." And so this was reported in the Tribune in 2012. And of course, it feels as if it could have been reported in 2022. And I think that this is the issue. In most jurisdictions, it's generally regarded that the law should never abandon anyone. And in some jurisdictions, you see this maybe at its most extreme, where if I break into your house and I'm armed with a knife, and you try and prevent me and you're armed with a gun and you shoot me, then you can actually be charged with the use of excessive force to protect your property. So although I'm doing something wrong, I'm still protected to some extent by the law. And I think that it's interesting that here we've got 45,000 people or so who are abandoned by the law when it comes to a severe act of harm. And as Nyambi was mentioning, the rapist is invariably a violent person. We see this not only in our studies, but you also see this in the prison statistics. There are very few people in prison, as I understand it, there are very few people in prison only for the crime of rape. Most of the men who are in prison for rape are there for rape plus a violent offense. And so you clearly see that violence being manifested by the fact that they are there for multiple offenses, and typically the other offense is rape. Is a violent offense. And so that connection between rape being another act of violence, and I think this is where the protection of the woman needs to be seen in that wider context, as Dr. Campbell was mentioning. It's not a singular characteristic of that person. It's part of the tools, if you like, the part of the tools that the person uses to control the other person in his life.
I just wanted to add to that, the number of persons that William is indicating are unprotected by the law, that as you read the study also, the suggestion that not only that are they left unprotected by the law, but they're left unprotected, and oftentimes they have no recourse or with any other place to go, right? They have to often go back to these same environments, or feel like they have to go back to the same environments in which this abuse occurred. So there's really a cycle of violence that is in some ways inevitable, right? Because there is no reprieve for the person that is experiencing the violence. And with that, I think that it's also important to note that we want to address this issue for the many victims of the violence, but also to be able to heal the perpetrators, right? That until we can clearly identify that these rapes are happening, that there are men that are rapists, right? Then we can't begin to address what their issues are and the violence that they are embodying, and allow them to also get the healing, the treatments, and the rehabilitation that they need.
And I think that what makes it even more urgent is that these perpetrators of violence are among us. They are living in our communities, in our societies. And, you know, for the women who have reported that they've been the victims of rape within marriage, and even those who are not in marriages, but who are in intimate relationships, there might be children involved. And so what's the impact on that? So there are other factors, there are other things, other impacts to be considered. And so I think that this study helps us to have the kinds of conversations that we need to have so that we can address a very serious issue. I want to take a break right here, right now, our first break on University Drive. And when we come back, we'll continue this discussion. We'll take a break and be back after this.
Chapter One Bookstore is your back-to-school headquarters. We are proud to serve the students, faculty, and staff of the University of the Bahamas and the community at large. We are the premier choice for the purchase of university textbooks and supplies, and UB logo apparel, paraphernalia, and gifts. We also carry a wide variety of school supplies, learning aids, and leisure books. Visit our copy center throughout the semester for all of your printing, copying, and binding needs. Chapter One Bookstore is located on the ground floor of the Michael Eldon Complex. Call us at 397-2650 or email us at chapter1@ub.edu.bs. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Chapter One Bookstore. See you soon!
Welcome back to University Drive. We have as our guest Mr. William Fielding, researcher and adjunct faculty member at University of the Bahamas, as well as associate professor in the School of Social Sciences, Nyambi Hall Campbell-Dean. Dr. Campbell-Dean, we were talking about so many things in relation to the study that Mr. Fielding and his students did that has generated data on marital rape and rape in intimate partner relationships. One of the points that you had made is that as this information is generated and we're getting new knowledge, we also have a responsibility to take this kind of information and begin to address healing. Healing also within the people who are the perpetrators of these acts. And Mr. Fielding also added that it's more than merely looking at it as rape. It's really violence. And there is a need for us to approach this holistically. Why don't you continue on that?
Yeah, I think that we're seeing violence in our communities. We're seeing, and we often are able to talk about it or readily admit to it when it comes to murder. But when we are talking about violence within the context of our relationships, a lot of times I think we downplay it, or we don't even acknowledge what it is, and that may be a function of of not really recognizing what violence in relationships looks like, not really recognizing what models of healthy relationships look like. And so I think that's why it's important, as we continue to have these conversations about marital rape, that we do them within the context of building healthy relationships and noting that this is the goal, right? That the goal is not necessarily to remove the role of men in our society, to diminish the status of the husband in the household, or to lessen the respect or the admiration that we have for men, right? Because that does not lead to a healthy relationship either. Healthy relationships are built off of mutual respect and mutual understanding. And so that is a goal that we're aiming for. And I think that we can talk about marital rape and criminalizing marital rape and acknowledging that marital rape exists while also honoring and respecting men.
Do you think that a part of it also has to do with a reluctance to challenge the status quo in terms of the power structure that we have in our society?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Nobody necessarily likes to feel like they are losing. And I think we have to begin to acknowledge that patriarchy is a part of the Bahamian society. And that's not something that's exclusive to us as Bahamians, but it's there and it does exist. And so we have to begin to dismantle that patriarchy. And I know that it's difficult to see because Bahamian women are thriving in so many arenas, in so many areas, right? I think there was a statistic around the Bahamas having one of the largest number of women in middle management positions in the world. Right. But then at the same time, when we look at the number of women in political leadership roles, that number is very low. Jamaica, Dominica, and I think Barbados have had female prime ministers, right? That's within the region. The Bahamas has yet to have a female prime minister or to really have women in those very significant political leadership positions en masse in the country. And so we have to begin to have conversations about patriarchy and what that looks like and how that affects us, and that patriarchy is bleeding into our relationships and that patriarchy is also in the church.
What I find interesting, Mr. Fielding, also is that, and I always think about this whenever our guests are researchers who are producing findings and new knowledge. I always ask the question about how are we to use this new information? What is it incumbent upon us to do? How are we changing behavior for the better? How are our policies reflecting the information and the data and the findings that are being generated? How will this information be used so that we can make our society better, our relationships better, ourselves better?
Well, I can only say how I might like it to be used. I've got no say as to how it will be used, but there have been quite a few public fora where politicians from of both sides of the house have got up and talked about the importance of what they do being driven by data, being grounded in reality as best we understand it, and not just being sort of, this seems like a good idea sort of thing. So my purpose in doing the research is to, if you like, challenge or revisit accepted public opinion, and to, where possible, if you like, replace, not necessarily change, but if it's unfounded, change those opinions by something which we can actually substantiate. And I think this was one of the driving forces about the piece on the marital rape, and also earlier studies that we looked at when we were looking at consent in sexual intercourse, because a lot of people don't understand that, in a sense, they don't appreciate that they have had sex technically against their will when they've been unable to give consent. And so there's quite a lot of ignorance as to when sex is actually consensual or not, because we do have people who consent to sexual intercourse because they're afraid of their partner, which is all part of the violence syndrome that we've been talking about. So there are many levers that are there, and I think that what it goes to show is the importance, as Dr. Hall has Nyambi has been talking about, was the importance of recognizing the violence and recognizing the need to resolve differences without conflict. And of course, that sort of anger management is the sort of thing that has been looked at with the tunnel of violence hypothesis that Dr. What's his name now? You'll remind me of the psychologist. Dr. Allen has worked on regarding murderers and other violent people. There may well be similarities that we could work on, which may help with the rehabilitation of these people, because of course when we send people to prison, that's supposed to be a period of rehabilitation, but it's clear from the fact that these people can come out of prison and reoffend and go back again. It may demonstrate that the measures being taken to rehabilitate people could be improved, and it may be that the improvement could be enhanced by a better understanding as to what type of person is committing sexual offences. We've had studies done, for example, by Chaswell Hanna looking at murders, but we haven't had a similar study to look at rapes, to look at the profile of a rapist. And so until we've got a better idea as to, in a sense, what that person might look like, I think it's going to make the rehabilitation a little bit more difficult. But the point is with doing the research is that you can put yourself in a position to ask new questions, which without the prior research, you would probably not even have dreamt of asking, or you wouldn't have a basis to ask them. And so I think that that's one of the useful purposes of doing the research, is that we're advancing the conversation into areas which previously might have been, if you like, just based on speculation, but we've now got a basis for that conversation, and then it opens up new avenues for research to which we currently don't know the answer. So this morning in my class, we were talking about the results of this study, and someone said, well, why does that happen? And I said, we don't know, but at least you can now ask the question, why? Before you saw the results, you wouldn't have even asked the question. And so just being in a space to ask the new question is a step in the right direction.
Indeed.
So it also seems to me that right now the debate is raging about marital rape, but it also seems to me that there should be a space in the national discourse and discussion about violence, like Dr. Campbell Dean alluded to earlier, because rape is about violence. And you have also pointed out, Mr. Fielding, that a lot of the offenders who are behind bars, only a small number are there for just only rape. It's rape and other violent acts, right? So shouldn't we intentionally create a space for conversations about violence in this country? I mean, Dr. Campbell Dean pointed out too that it isn't a coincidence, our high rate of murders and violence, and then the data that's coming out about marital rape and intimate partner relationships. What are your thoughts?
I definitely think that there needs to be a space. I think that this study and the conversation around violence with it, there was a report that came out around 6,000 reported cases of gender-based violence in the Bahamas over the period of 10 years. But yet I've also been in Zoom meetings with public officials who deny that the violence that is occurring within relationships has anything to do with gender. So I think that we need to have a myriad of conversations, right? Conversations about consent, conversations about healthy relationships, conversations about violence, conversations about patriarchy, how it works, and gender. And we can keep those conversations to the level of the people that we're having them with, right? Because especially conversations about violence, for example, need to begin in primary school. How do you deal with conflict, right? And then go up through the ranks from there. But the conversations need to happen, but they can happen in ways that we're implementing them within the things that we do every day, so that it doesn't have to be something necessarily separate in our lives. How do we talk to each other in nonviolent ways, right? How do we drive on the road in nonviolent ways, so that it can be palatable and incorporated, not seen as something separate.
And Mr. Fielding?
Yes, I think that this, you know, it all stems from this lack of being able to, if you like, resolve conflict without taking on a violent role. And you know, how much that is to do with negative parenting practices at an early age. If I'm using corporal punishment, if you like, to try and get someone to change an action, then obviously the child is going to learn that by being inflicting some sort of physical violence on another, I can get that person to behave in a way that I want them to behave. And so right from the beginning, from within the home, there may well be cues being given to the children, but the use of violence can be beneficial to me to get my way. And this obviously makes it a very self-centered approach. And we can end up effectively breeding, rearing violence by the way that we bring up our children. So I think the whole parenting practices need to be should be scrutinized. And of course, we've demonstrated that excessive use of corporal punishment, not only here but elsewhere, that has detrimental consequences for the child as it becomes an adult. It breeds, if you like, produces violent adults if you excessively use the corporal punishment. So there are elements of how we treat the children in home which eventually start to play out on the street. If we've got violent, if we're bringing people up in the sense at risk of making them violent, then obviously if I want to have sex with a woman and she doesn't want it, then I will use whatever means I can to extract that from her. And so, I think there's that continuum which needs to be analyzed. And what we're probably, you might argue, we're looking at the wrong end. We're looking at the sad end of a story rather than saying, how can we stop the sad story from ever being written?
So what is this research saying about ourselves? And then what is it calling us to do in terms of action? That may step a little bit out of the scientific, right? But I just thought it was a question that needed to be asked.
Well, I hope that ultimately, I suppose, I hope that it will give the decision makers some additional support or otherwise for them to decide what they're going to do in terms of are they going to change the law when it comes to marital rape, because it's in their hands. What is interesting, of course, is that Virginia Valance and I did an earlier study, and the group, we interviewed about 2,000 people with my students, and what was interesting was that the 55 and over male group of respondents, they were least likely to support the idea of making marital rape illegal. And of course, that age group happens to be the decision-making age group. And so within the younger age groups, males and females, there was more support for making rape within marriage illegal. So perhaps this is also telling us that even if today's decision makers, if you like, kick the ball down the road, the change will eventually come as the older people, their influence wanes, and that there is a rising current of support for the protection of women from rape within marriage.
Dr. Campbell Dean, a marriage, I believe that marriage is one of those institutions in Bahamian society that has that sanctity attached to it, and not a whole lot of us who are traditional in terms of the way that we approach society and the community and relationships and what exists really want to rock the sanctity of that. The way that we view marriage, do you think that that is also hindering us in terms of dealing with this whole question of violence and forcing one's will upon another person within the bounds of marriage?
I think that's the part of the conversation that always kind of confounds me the most, because um, within the law, you're not married until you sign the marriage certificate. The law does not say that you're not married until the pastor says that you're man and wife, right? Like in the Bahamas, you do not need clergy to designate you as being married. And so if we think of marriage from the perspective of being a sanctimonious relationship, then that's the key in that is love, right? But there is no love in violence. There's no love in rape, and so that's why I'm often confused when this issue comes up as being one that is against the way that the church is viewing it. And I think that we need to just I think this is where the conversation about consent and what consent really is important to have, and that I think we can have those hard relationships, those hard conversations with inside the church, right? Can we have conversations in the church about what consent is? And do that with clergy as well as lay people. I think that that would be really, really fruitful and beneficial.
So our time is winding down. It's amazing how quickly time flies, especially when you're having good conversation with good people. But as we wrap up, and I extend to you an opportunity to offer your wrap-up comments, we're in an era where we've gone through so much, and a lot of attention, certain people have said, should be placed on us being deliberately kind to each other. And that just puts me in the mind of Character Day that recently happened, and promoting qualities of high moral character and things like kindness, especially when we think about what some of the people who are in our society are enduring at the hands of those who are inflicting their will on others. But I offer you this time now for your wrap-up comments. We'll start with the lady, Dr. Campbell Dean.
I think the main thing is that we have the capacity to have these conversations, and so that we should begin to have them. I think that when we have these conversations about marital rape, note that we're really having conversations about violence. We're really having conversations about power. We're really having conversations about control. And we're really having conversations about how do we want to treat each other in our communities. How do we want to be treated? How do we want to be respected? How do we want people to view us as Bahamian men, us as Bahamian women? How do we want our daughters to be treated? How do we want our daughters to relate to our sons, right? That the conversation about marital rape is not specifically about rape, but it's a conversation about who and how we interact with each other, and that this rape that we're talking about happens within the context. And so as we begin to understand the context and break that context down, we can understand that we can have these conversations about marital rape without them being contentious, and with ultimately respecting each other.
Food for thought. Mr. Fielding?
Yes, I think Nyambe's point there is, but it really focuses on the respecting the dignity of the other person and being respectful of that person. And if you think about it, love is never self-centered. Love is always looking outwards. And the whole idea, I mean, one of the phrases that I heard recently, which I found slightly disturbing, was in the context of the marital rape debate, and it said, somebody, I overheard someone saying, she must give it up. That phrase rather jarred with me, because I didn't see that there was any love in that. It was a demand. There was no sharing. There was no giving. It was all about taking, and taking is essentially a selfish exercise. And I think that somehow or other we have to we have to get people to think more of others, put the other before themselves. And if we succeeded in doing that, that would really change the shape and nature of our relationships with each other.
Well, this hour was just too short. I have 50 million other questions, and so you have to come back and join us at some point later on in the season. Mr. William Fielding, Dr. Nyambe Hall Campbell Dean, thank you so much for joining us as guests on University Drive, our 9th season. Thank you so much to our listeners for joining us for this period. This has been University Drive. I've been your host, Tamika Lundy. Join us again next time for University Drive.
University Drive is a production of the Office of University Relations and the Communications and Creative Arts Academic Unit at University of the Bahamas. All rights reserved.